Good evening, everybody, and welcome to another installment of our Conscious Conversations chats. I am your host, Peter Daniel, and today we have Dr. James Raaff with us. Thank you so much for joining us, James. I'm looking forward to our conversation.
My pleasure. Thanks, Peter. Hi, everyone.
So just to do a bit of housekeeping, I have muted everybody so that we don't have tons of people talking at the same time. You're welcome to leave your video on or off. It's totally up to you. We can't see most of you. And we will be going through some content for about 45 minutes, and then we'll take questions for 15 at the end. The question time, you can either unmute yourself or you can put in the chat screen. And while we're doing our conversation, if you do have a burning question, you're welcome to put it in the chat screen. And if it's in flow, we will address it and answer it. And if there are any interesting links and or slides, either James or I will put them up and show them to you guys. All right, James, this talk is called Nutrigenomics and Precision-Based Healthcare. It's a massive mouthful, probably scare most people to consider what that actually is. I mean, we met because I came to you for this exact thing, to look at my genetics and see, what to eat and how to exercise and a whole host of other stuff. So I've gone through that kind of process, and I know that's what you do at the House of Holistic Health, amongst other things. So maybe just before we get into nutrigenomics and what the DNA tests are and how they work, I'd like to just ask you what your perspective on conscious is. The word conscious, I call this conscious conversations because I find a lot of conversation that's often just unconscious dross that just percolates up. How's the weather? Were you told to wear a mask today? And we're trying to do something a little differently. So give me a 5 minutes of there.
Ooh, that's
2
tough,
minutes,
Peter.
2 minutes.
that's my second favorite topic in the world. Really, it's the most exciting, not work reading that I do, but it of course has to do with work. It has to do with everything. And okay, let me say that I would say I had a conversation yesterday with a 7-year-old, and she was asking. She kind of asked some questions about consciousness and being conscious. And I said to her, she's got a little dog sitting next to her, and I said, you sitting next to me, you're very aware that something's going on. Like you look out and you respond to your environment, which is not the full definition of consciousness, but there's a story playing in your mind space that tells you that there's something going on. And beyond that, we really can't actually say much. I asked her then, do you think that your little dog sitting there, it clearly responds. If you call it, it looks at you, it pats, it plays, or what have you. But do you think the dog has a story going on in its head? And she said, yes, of course. And I said, I completely agree with you. And then I said, what about the ant walking across the table here? And she went, yeah, hang on. And she got stuck. So we got into a really cool conversation about at what point do we feel that a living being is conscious, in the definition of consciousness, meaning does the thing have an experience of its being, of its existence? So I'd say that's a starting point. What it speaks to in terms of healthcare and our existence is, I think that there's an inner life that goes on at the same time, or it's inseparable from the observed life or the lived life. And in what we're going to talk about tonight, I'd say that falls in the category of intrinsic epigenetics, in terms of the patterns that we can identify that go on in that story within ourselves. The thought patterns, the emotional patterns, and the belief patterns are the three major intrinsic factors that influence who we are, what we become, what we have become up to this point. And the stuff that you mentioned about exercise and diet and all of that are the extrinsic patterns, but they both very much apply. If you have to ask me today, after 25 years in practice, I'd say without doubt the intrinsic patterns are the power ones, and the tougher ones to discuss, and the tougher ones to assist patients or people to change.
I mean, I was going to leave this for later, but that it kicks up something quite strong for me. I mean, we have a medical system worldwide right now that doesn't take that into account at all. It only looks at symptoms and then deals with symptoms. You know, as a medical practitioner, and obviously this comes a lot from the germ theory that says, you know, germs and microbes and bacteria make you sick and you need to take something to kill them. How have you found, you know, dealing with medicine and dealing with healthcare? You know, you've just expressed that you've got intrinsic and extrinsic factors. I mean, it's a totally different way of looking at medicine and healthcare.
Well, fortunately, not all of even Western trained allopathic medical practitioners feel the same way. And a large number of them, and in more recent times, that body of people dissatisfied with the germ theory and the biomedical model of medicine, that it has massively grown. And that's probably, as a clinician, was the super exciting discovery I made around a decade ago, and then did formal postgraduate work in integrative medicine, where solutions to or ways of practicing were presented to us, which said, hey, there's much more to this than blood pressure and pharmaceutical approaches and treating you like a chemistry bag. So that is really what integral or integrative medicine is. It's saying we talk about the mind body, but I mean, they're not two things, they're one thing. And modern integrative and functional models of healthcare are inclusive of almost every perspective we can have on being human. It has to include how we think about being human and how we feel about everything, and I think that those cognitive patterns and emotional patterns are what generate our belief patterns. It builds our spiritual system for most people. I haven't had a religious spiritual epiphany about anything in my life. It's slowly been revealed to me through the other integration in being.
So would you say this is then, I mean, I saw on your website, whole system philosophy?
Yeah, I mean, if we aren't concerned with the experience that a patient has, then anything we say is going to have less traction. It's about, I sometimes use it in the definition that we use about the medicine that we practice. We say it's relationship-centered, and I think that's a really nice place to begin. So saying like no experience can happen without you, the subject, and then the context or the object as well. And when it's about healthcare, there's a healthcare giver in the relationship and a healthcare receiver. But the stuff that comes out of it comes out of the relationship, which means you have to pay attention and listen to what the person in front of you is experiencing, what their problems are, what they feel and what they think and what they believe. If we use the bag of tools that Western medicine gives us, we're going to come across many, many patients that don't have a belief system that includes those tools or the belief in those tools. And so we have to use something else. Fortunately, the amount of training, education, and openness to knowledge about ancient medicine, about folklore, about traditional Chinese medicine, about Ayurvedic medicine, about about African traditional medicine. There are a lot more general practitioners out there that are open to saying, well, what does that have to say about a condition or a person's situation? I think if you had to list the bag of tools, modalities of intervention, of clinical intervention, in our practice alone, there are loads of them, but we don't wield all those tools every time we see a new patient, and we try not to yield our favorite. You'd be surprised as to how many people change their mode of practice based on the last weekend's workshop. You know, if you've been at a workshop about detox, it would be scary to do really fly on the wall study of how many practitioners who attended the workshop find that everything that's going wrong with the patients in the successive weeks is about detoxification. That's kind of our bias we have to be cautious about.
Sure, okay. I mean, it's very heartwarming to hear that you think that more doctors in that old medical paradigm are starting to recognize that treating the body like a mechanistic machine that needs to have parts replaced or repaired is shifting to something more holistic.
Yeah, the incidence and frequency of medical practitioner burnout and qualitative discussions with those people is, I think, evidence that, you know, if you burning it on a system that is just like not fulfilling, it's not really creating the outcomes you want the patients on it. There are a lot of heads of departments and academics involved in spheres of Western medicine who I'm sure at home are pulling their hair out saying, we're just not helping these people. What are we doing wrong? So that's a nice place to start. And that it most certainly has started. You know, there's a definite movement of, it's not re-education, but it's to a large degree repurposing existing practitioners and saying, what are the tools that you really need to build relationships with your patients? And if you just do that, you're already going to have success. I mean, I remember the day one of one of the courses that I've done in integrative medicine, and the professor was talking about a study done in the US. I can't remember the methodology, but imagine it's a decent way of describing it, that in the consulting rooms of physicians, of MDs, was this little camera with a timer. And as new patients sat down, the doctor would say, how are you? You know, and then the timer would start. And what they assessed was the amount of time that elapsed before the patient was interrupted in telling their story. Why are you here? By the doctor, by the physician. In other words, to either sort of start acting, start prescribing, start whatever. And we were asked, what do you think that average time across this group of US physicians was? So you all now are conscious and you're having the answer for yourselves. But I remember at the time going, sure, maybe 5 minutes. And the study showed that it was 18 seconds.
18 seconds.
And I think most of us, there were a lot of physicians on the course and they probably felt guilty, but they all just said, wow, we did, you know, we thought it was bad, but not that bad. And really what the moral of that story is that the practitioners don't listen. And that's where a relationship begins, isn't it? I mean, even if you want to develop a relationship with what you call yourself, you have to listen to what's going on in your head and what you are feeling in wherever you feel, in your heart. So that's a good starting point, listening. And then probably also saying, I don't know what's going on, but let's talk and let's listen and then let's figure out a strategy. The tools come later.
That's fantastic. I mean, I've never quite understood how someone could go to doctor, get a prescription, and then come back 6 months later, get a second prescription, and then within 5 to 10 years, you're on 20 different pills and you need a special bag for your pill bag. So that's fantastic. So you obviously do it entirely differently then when you're, you know, meeting. If I was wanting to be a client of yours, I mean, what kind of process would you introduce someone to the work that you do?
I think first of all, what has been a natural progression is the amount of time that I spent with a person in the first appointment, and it's seldom under an hour. So a lot of our biomedical colleagues may see 6 to 8 patients in that time, and I don't know if it's the curricula at universities or the way that medicine is. That's a lot of things that leads to that, but I suppose I just had a feeling that was later confirmed by some more education that I just need to spend more time with it. It's a two-way conversation. I mean, there's a lot of listening, there's a lot of talking, but I also have to explain what I would deem the basic process of how I work. I think that another definition that will come in beside it being relationship-centered is that it's personalized. In other words, a huge amount of medicine in the last 200 years has been based on the power of large studies, of group studies, and of studying statistical norms and statistical norms. So if you saw a study that was talking about some sort of knee injury, and the big respected studies about this particular knee condition contained subject numbers in excess of 5,000, they deemed powerful. But as that sample group gets larger and larger, the meaning for the individual sitting in front of you becomes less and less relevant, because you don't know where all the data on the entire curve is the representation of the human population. And you won't know if a person is sitting in the 50th percentile or is an outlier. When it comes to pharmaceuticals, sometimes the outliers are killed by the medicine that helps the people under the peak of the curve. So moving towards trying to actually be paying attention to an individual and this person's experience, and then the biochemical information inside them that may also be relevant to presentation of disease or condition. I think that's valuable. That for me was the power of genetics, because what that does is it says we can now have a conversation about this unique biochemistry bag in front of us and the other intrinsic things that are relevant to this patient. So that would be my process. I'd first listen to the person, see what they're there for, and essentially begin the very long process of building a professional relationship, because that sense that you are listening to a patient is way more powerful than I think most people realize.
Absolutely.
If you do qualitative interviews with patients with chronic disease where they have seen 4, 5, 6 different practitioners, that's the number one complaint. Nobody seems to be listening, and then the tools come in. I think that you mentioned earlier, you said that the future of medicine, or 21st century medicine is interested in looking at the uniqueness of each individual biochemically, because although we're all very, very similar, the tiny differences down to a genetic level are what make all the difference. And when we get multiple factors leveraging or gearing together, outcomes can be radically different. So some of the best lecturers and authors in this field say that 20th century medicine was all about what is happening in this patient. It's about really identifying the biochemical processes and coming to a diagnosis. I'm not interested in a diagnosis. In fact, we work reversed. We say, let's not jump to a diagnosis. Let's rather try and have a look at the underlying big systems, including intrinsic systems, that might be leading to the imbalance that you're experiencing. And if we provide support at the priority areas of those underlying systems, then the innate intelligence and interrelatedness and interdependence of these systems will find its way. That is something that I think most people acknowledge. There is an amazing capacity to heal that is innate.
That's a profound difference to, I think, how most people experience it. I mean, it's normally get a label, that label stuck with you for life, and that label is managed by some other pill. You're talking about actually
the diagnosis will build an internal narrative. Once you've been given the disease, you start saying, "Oh, that's my story," and then you'll tell it to yourself and you'll tell it to other people. The question that 21st century medicine is trying to answer is, why is this happening? If we can answer both, we the best off.
I believe that most people die pretty much to the day they're told if they get a cancer diagnosis. That intrinsic factor is so powerful. The story you tell yourself is so powerful.
Yeah, I mean, really, Peter, that's nail on the head. You know, if people who assist healthcare providers could help change the narrative in a person, then you changing those three powerful intrinsic epigenetic patterns of cognitive thinking patterns, emotional patterns, and what you believe. I mean, that is extremely powerful. There's enough good science to already show that if we can see these patterns change, that we can measure biochemical outcomes that are likely to be as a result of that. I mean, there's many factors, but there's a lot of studies that show that.
That's fantastic. Sure.
Even Western medicine already acknowledges that about 30% of all positive results are placebo. Approximately 30% is the number bandied about. So he's saying, well, on the idea that you have been given something that's going to help you, about 30% of people get better.
That's a massive number.
Little, but it is huge.
That's huge. Belief system and the power of belief. We covered this quite extensively last week when I last week when I did my own talk, in the week before with JP, just, you know, the intensity that belief system has in ruling your life and your health outcomes. So look, one of the things I really loved about you too is, you know, there is that conversation and there is that looking deeper into what's the underlying process or processes at work here, but you also have some really powerful tools at your disposal to check what's going on internally to the body, you know, particularly the genetics. So maybe just spend a few minutes on chatting about that and how that fits in.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, this is where there's a lot of high-tech medicine that's kind of scary and dangerous, and we've already seen things like mammograms and other types of invasive imaging techniques. Medicine has basically done U-turns on that kind of stuff. I think there are no more mammograms done in Germany. I think that's a pretty accurate statement because of the risk in using the mammogram. But the biotech we can't throw all the biotech out. We've got some pretty amazing new science. And since 2003, when the entire human genome was eventually mapped out, and it started a race to say, okay, well, let's see if we can take this 3.2 billion word book of the human genome, written in 4 letters, not 26, and see what it's saying. What are these phrases in these paragraphs, these 23 paragraphs, chromosomes, and what are they actually saying? And some of the biotechnology there allows us to see, oh, this little piece of code is about Peter's blonde hair and his blue eyes, and this is his stature, and these are things we can't see about him. This is his liver function, and this is his these are genes in a whole group that have to do with the healing and repair system, the interleukin genes. And these genes are really interesting, and they have to do with your sort of, let's say, I often talk about it like of your 6 cylinders, or 8, if you want to be an 8 cylinder, of your 8 cylinders of methylation, DNA repair and preventing DNA damage and manufacturing new DNA. Are you firing on all cylinders? That's very important. And we've seen that further progression in understanding genetics has allowed us to see that, we have subtle differences in a tiny amount of the human genome that account for all the variation that we can see and can't see in all humans that have ever lived. It all has a genetic component. The genomics, that's the genetic side. The genomic side is the further study in terms of what in the environment is in relationship with the gene that can, we call it induce the gene, and it basically means switch it on or switch it off or alter its expression. So from the one side, the biotech has allowed us to analyze the human genome and see which variations of all these genes that we know something about do you have, and then what do we know about the environmental patterns that we can change could address the variants that you have that are at the highest priority relevant to what you might be experiencing. So that's why I almost let this biotechnology reveal some detail about an individual, and then let the details of that individual guide the strategy for helping them. So you seldom going to find somebody who has every single gene system that we look at requiring a high priority of support. And when you do have when we look at maybe 5 or 6 big subsystems, there's no single genes that we can test that will determine an outcome. There's too many combinations. So we're looking at like gene systems that look after major physiological processes. The big processes that I'm interested in looking at is number 1, methylation, DNA repair, and the second is detoxification, phase 2 liver detoxification, phase 1 and phase 2 detoxification, inflammation processes or the healing system of the body, healing and repair, the reduction oxidation balance in the body, and structural integrity, collagen, bone, tissues, joints, skin. And I think that's basically, we can just say that that's a good place to start. Now, it's very interesting for me when I can look at the gene systems that are very involved in those in those subsystems of health and say, wow, you've got several variants, which basically tell me this is the area of highest priority. In other words, this is where we must try to support you. And then we can say, okay, which are the genes in this system? And how do we know anything about how they are in relationship with various lifestyle patterns? So let's start with the extrinsic patterns. And we say, well, this is where listening to the patient comes in. Tell me about your sleep and relaxation patterns of your life for as long as you want, but obviously it gets a little bit more relevant in more recent time. Tell me about the exercise and movement patterns. Tell me about your nutrition and hydration patterns. Tell me about stress and your capacity to deal with it and manage it. And tell me about social factors, relationships and networks. Those are all extrinsic patterns and extrinsic relationships that we can ask questions about. We can even measure empirically certain things with respect to those patterns. And then the juicy stuff, the intrinsic patterns. Tell me about what you think about. What are the thoughts that mull through your head? What are your understandings, your cognitive patterns? And then emotional patterns, and then belief systems. And then we've got a massive network of connections to begin looking at from a bird's eye view and say, okay, priority 1, 2, 3. My job is to take that and radically simplify it to action steps that the patient believes in and is prepared to attempt tweaking.
Yeah, brilliant that you radically simplifying, but that you've made the separation between the gene and genomics, where the gene, because a lot of people, when they hear gene, they just think, oh geez, if I got that gene, that means I'm like doomed for life. Like I just think about all the women who chop off their breasts because they have some gene that says they're going to get breast cancer. And they never consider that actually there could be lifestyle factors at play that might turn genes on and off. Epigenetics, for example. But it's great that you touched on that. It's not, your gene is not like a sentence.
Absolutely. It's a very common misconception. And it's also quite important to quickly allay a person's fears. If I begin having this discussion, whether it's with a potential patient or at a dinner party or with a friend, a lot of people have said, no, I don't want to know what's in there. I don't want to know what I'm going to die of. And I said, no. Okay, now I know what discussion we have to have. But without getting too deep into it, it's important to understand within all these gene systems, there are particular genes which we will term high penetrance. And another way of referring to a high penetrance gene variant is a genetic mutation. Then we get medium penetrance genes and we get low penetrance genes. Genetics and genomics in healthcare deals with almost all the low penetrance and a couple of medium penetrance genes. The number of high penetrance or genetic mutations that exist is smaller. It's more rare. And some of them mean that if we find that genetic mutation in a person, you're going to have major health problems or not make it very long. So something like one that off the top of my head is cystic fibrosis. It actually jumps a generation. So if a grandparent has it, the children won't have it. But then genetic counselors have to come in and say the likelihood of you having a child with cystic fibrosis is extremely high. And so it might influence your decision to have children. Because there's hardly any way around that mutation. medium and low penetrance genetic variants are inducible, that we're able to make changes to the environment of that gene and get it to switch on or switch off. So your outcomes are not determined by the gene alone. They never are. Most people listening, and you most certainly, Peter, we've talked about Dr. Bruce Lipton. And I mean, the sort of little catchphrase above his head as I see him in my mind is the biology of belief. And he's a microbiologist whose whole life basically studied cells in a petri dish. And one of the things that he came realize very early on in his career was that if you've got a little single cell reactive organism, it might or might not have consciousness, but it most certainly reacts to it in its environment. And you drop some acid on the side of the petri dish, the little cell moves away from it. And if you drop some sugar, it moves towards it. So how do you control the behavior of a cell? You don't try and prod the cell, you manipulate the environment. And that shows us that there's something that's connecting the cell to its environment. In humans, that's termed the epigenome. So for every gene, you've got this little thing coiled around it, a histone body and a little, almost like an aerial. And it's that epigenetic component of our genome that's very interesting and that connects us to the environment. Biotech has allowed us, and modern medicine has allowed us to see that connection. And the omic sciences, the genomics, the stress genomics, the exercise genomics, the sleep genomics, the nutrigenomics, very powerful. And all the other omics are very, very rapidly growing and trying to identify what speaks to the gene systems and gets our command centers and our giant recipe book and manufacture systems working or not working. That's really the relationship that we work with.
Fantastically put. I remember the other thing that we spoke about when I went to see you is that, you know, for most people who want to get into health and shift their lifestyle, they have endless potential things to do. You know, they're in a warehouse of options. And you described to me where if you do your genetic analysis, you can take that warehouse and you can narrow it down to a few shelves that you need to look at. And I really like that way of looking at things.
Yeah, that's awesome. Are we recording this, Peter? Yes, we are.
Definitely.
So I'm going to use that. It is spot on. You know, like what you can do is, it's overwhelming and right to the point of you saying, okay, I'm going to go out and do something for myself. There's so much noise and there's so much clutter and there's so much misinformation, and there's so much marketing and there's so much wrong information. And in amongst all that are the diamonds in the rough and the stuff that's relevant to you. There are a lot of diamonds, but it's about whether it's a diamond for you. And for sure, the whole process of genetics and genomics can unclutter that process. That's something that a group of like-minded colleagues of mine are starting to do now. We're starting to say, look, even without the genetic tests, I think that it's extremely powerful, but not everybody needs a genetics test. I think that the tests were expensive in the past, and because more and more people are doing them, just like I hope more people buy non-fossil fuel driven cars, the production numbers and the cost of those things is going to come down as people realize that they're possible to own or do. And so I always joke that the first full genome analysis done at a US university under research conditions, they calculated what that cost of a single full genome analysis was. And it was $10 million US. No, it wasn't. It was $100 million US. $100 million US. Then I say to patients, today it's a little cheaper. So, you know, and then we're saying, you know, for under 10,000 Rand, perhaps the actual genomics tests, many of them are under 5,000 Rand now, and they contain a huge amount of information on which you can act. Mm. Without even having that, I think that through some advancements in understanding of the genome and genomics has led to us creating nutraceuticals, functional foods, which act in a nutrigenomic manner. And so what they're doing is we're realizing they're in relationship with the expression of some of our genes. That's very different than putting in chemistry we think is missing or necessary, without which you can't live. It's and so that means that in that noise or sea of products and foods out there, there's some which really deserve to be put on a special shelf in that warehouse and say, look, even if you don't know anything about your genome, experiment with these guys because they're worth it. They're likely to give you some good experience. I don't know whether you need the L-theanine or the cocoa or the food that's rich in some sort of antioxidant support, but these are the worthwhile ones playing with.
Fantastic. Yeah, that's two things on there quickly before we carry on. First was that, we were talking about the cost of the test, the amount of money you can save by narrowing down what you're going to do to support your health. It pays for that many times over in your lifetime. And it's one test for your lifetime, right? You don't need to keep retesting. So it's once you got your map. And then
absolutely.
And the other thing was, you see a lot of clients and patients, you must see things that are common to people, and you kind of touched on it now, certain things which, can be effective or offer support for pretty much anyone, wherever they are in their lives.
Absolutely. It applies forever, but, and it's quite a tricky thing. At some point I was perhaps seeing patients and thinking, I wonder if I could do a questionnaire or talk to them and then try to guess where I think they need support and then have a look at the genome. But I soon gave up on that. It's really, really not possible to do. You remember that most of what we're talking about here is chronic patterns of imbalance or chronic mismatches leading to chronic disease. And modern medicine treats acute infectious disease pretty well. Most certainly a hell of a lot better than we did a few hundred years ago. I heard Sam Harris the other day say, like one of the most important advancements in healthcare in the Western world or the modern world is just making sure that we keep our poop out of our food. He said it more strongly than that, but that makes a big difference. Okay, I'm talking about the ill health patterns that develop by having poor relationships for decades. And it's the choices the little things we do on a daily basis that make incremental changes that lead to these problems. Now, if you took 10 people with the same diagnosis of a coronary artery disease with some sort of plaque formation in coronary arteries, it's quite plausible that those 10 people arrived there through 10 completely different routes, quite completely different routes. Some through a large number that now believe through imbalance in the health of the endothelial walls and the inside lining of vessels. Others through issues about inappropriate dietary habits, which led to their metabolism not processing certain things that led to this. Others through pathogenic relationships like stress and alcohol and tobacco products and what have you. So a lot. And just because they all ended up with the same condition doesn't mean they got there in the same manner, which also tells me that helping them from there to change patterns to a healthier way is going to be 10 different patterns, 10 different ways of assisting them. And that's where, group studies tell you, okay, for epidemiological public health of communities, fine. We want to know how many people get this condition. If you suddenly find 80% of a population, like what happened in Finland, 70-something% of the population had heart disease. They were number one in the world in heart disease not that long ago. They're the type of society that said, hang on, let's change these patterns. And now they're like number, I think, 40-something in the world. That's a remarkable feat.
Sure.
That's where you need group studies. What I think is valuable here is saying, okay, if you've got 10 individuals, you have 10 different strategies, 10 different ways of dealing with them, 10 different reasons why they might have ended up with the same condition.
So do you find that a lot of your work then is just getting people off medication?
Sometimes, yes, because fortunately, there's new panels that we've got from the genetics labs called Pharmacogenomics. So we can immediately see drugs which just like really badly interact with particular gene variants that this patient might have. Some which are going to be metabolized way slower. In other words, they would linger around in the body longer, creating damage, or dose. It has relevance to dosage. What most practitioners will say, oh, you give this and you titrate. You like give them a little, you check, you give them more, and when they like start really not suffering, you take the dose down. That's full on guesswork. It's all we had, but now we don't have to do that. So I've had several patients where if they're on chronic meds, large numbers, we can use pharmacogenomics to immediately say, look, these, are you on any of these? Talk to the prescribing doctor and see if we can find alternatives. And then at a later stage, we can look at things like if somebody's on a life-saving drug, like a blood thinning drug, it in many conditions would be life-saving. And then if that patient in 2020 hasn't had a look at a couple of gene variants, like there's one called factor V Leiden, which is a gene that is heavily implicated in thrombus formation, deep vein thrombosis. If the person's on an anti-clotting drug and you don't know the status of that factor V Leiden, I'm like, there's something going wrong here in your medical team of support. And it's not one gene. Remember, most things that we're talking about is polygenomic, many genes are combining to produce the outcome that you see. But so there'd be like a cluster of genes which all have to do with vascular health and clotting. And I'd want to know all of those and immediately start saying, well, there are a whole lot of interesting foods, forms of exercise, hydration issues. I don't know. We'd have to look at what can be involved in inducing that gene system and get cracking at changing that. If down the line, we could measure, we call these biomarker tests, that the condition, the outcomes are shifting, then perhaps we can reduce the reliance on the drug and shift to more reliance on compliance with the pattern changes. Hmm. So I have had some very interesting cases cardiac cases where the patients have had a few issues going on and were about to be prescribed a whole lot of drugs. So then I assisted the patient in chatting with the cardiologist, dealing with the patient, and said, look, can you give us a little time to try and make some lifestyle pattern changes? And if you take some measurements, like whatever you want, the LDL, some cholesterol subfractions, triglycerides, blood pressure, whatever, and you see that there's a real change, that there may be a change in your prescription, and say, okay, well, let's hold off on those meds. I think that there's more openness these days of specialists to say, oh, okay, partly because they're getting educated in genetics and genomics, and I don't know the reasons. I just only know the ones that I've spoken to, and it has been quite, for me, it's been positive, and when the patients can see and then they realize that, hey, I've got to put in some effort here, that's really also valuable. when the patient takes responsibility, that's a big cognitive and emotional and belief system shift intrinsically, which means that that's quite powerful. But I've had some pretty radical, nasty cholesterol results look almost reversed to normal in a month or two, which was super cool. And then make some friends out of those cardiologists. Start showing you other case studies. Can you help here? Can you help here? I'd say all of that needs to be done in conjunction where there's high risk. It's not replacing medicine at all. It's empowering medicine to be more precise. It's about precision.
Sure. There's so much there. Wow. Feels like there's a bit more before we get into questions, though. Anything else you wanted to cover on how you see precision medicine today? I mean, what I love is that, I always talk about health sovereignty. People need to take responsibility for their health. And if you're using a shotgun approach to just blast, whether it's drugs or supplements, at yourself to try and be better, this really gets into the minutiae of what do you need? Where are you at? How can we pair those together? It's just an overall more conscious way of dealing with symptoms.
Yeah. That starting point is like, know thyself. Like, what's the deepest level you can know yourself? The curiosity and the positive energy of saying, look, it's not the be all and end all, but I can give you a snapshot of your genetic makeup now. And that ought to be, you ought to be highly curious. And then it's a case of me helping and explaining to you what we can learn from this. What does it mean? None of it means you're going to die of anything. It's too complex. There's too much. There are too many factors in play. But as you said, it narrows down the search. For me, it most certain, in the way that you do it, it most certainly builds a positive taking responsibility, and builds compliance and builds willingness to experiment. And these are all very valuable things in clinical intervention. What I think will be valuable to say, Peter, is through chatting with some very interesting, forward-thinking healthcare professionals and technology professionals, you've also seen the advent of wearables like the Oura Ring and watches and heart rate variability monitors and even t-shirts that change color with your temperature or something like that. But these are all things that Professor Yuval Noah Harari, the author of Sapiens and Homo Deus and 21 Lessons for the 21st Century, he says this is the biggest shift in the 21st century that he can see. And that is that some devices are going to know more about what's going on in us than we do pretty soon. And as long as we're the ones who benefit from that information and not someone else, that's an incredibly valuable thing. So what I'm thinking is, what a lot of guys, I think that there's biotech firms in healthcare with good intentions that are saying, if we can understand your genetics, we can develop strategy, and now we can have real-time ongoing information from your body about, basically it's like real-time biomarkers checking what's going on. Then the variable that's left is, we call it delta E, change in the environment. So like, okay, I start exercising a little more intensively, and I notice something that the ring or watch is picking up shift positively. So then I exercise even harder and it shifts further positively. And then I exercise even harder and it doesn't move. Then I go, okay, let me exercise a little less for the next 2, 3, 4, 5. I don't know how long. And you get what I'm saying. Mm-hmm. I think that the combination of personal knowledge, genetics, genomics will always inform how we address it, but added to the data from wearables and from other real-time monitoring is something very, very valuable.
Sure, that's very interesting. Yeah, getting results, are you winning with the strategy you're implementing? It's always the biggest question, and being able to get feedback on that is, sure.
Well, it's direct feedback and it's monitored. It's feedback you're generating from yourself. I mean, if you go for regular blood tests, once you've put in place a nutrigenomic plan, you're going to have biomarkers spaced out and going into the future. Say you're trying to normalize cholesterol levels, for example's sake. You change your dietary patterns, then 100 days down the line, you want to have a look at your cholesterols again and go, oh, wow, everything seems to be improving, but I've got like 50% to go. You carry on those patterns and then you see it improving more. Then you say, well, this pattern's working. Contrarily, if you exercise I'll pick a nasty one, but a vegan diet for some heart disease condition, and then 100 days down the line, your cholesterols have gone up, you start scratching your head and saying, well, maybe all other things being equal, this is not the diet for me. I've seen that happen.
That's fantastic, sure. Well, very exciting. I mean, luckily we don't live in an era anymore where bloodletting is the only option available.
Yep.
I was reading about that today in reading about vaccines. Maybe just give us a little comment. I mean, should people be scared about the flu right now, seeing as the world's locked down for it?
Should we be scared of
the flu, seeing as the whole world is locked down for it?
The seasonal flu or the flu?
They got a special name for it, I know.
Sure. I think the best stuff I've heard is an incredible guy that I think if anybody's interested in healthcare, we should follow some of the education from Dr. John Ioannidis. He's one of the guys that studies the quality of medical research, and he's uncovered problems in methodology and many forms of bias and vested interests and influence in the production of studies, in the publication of studies, in the peer review of studies, the outright theft of research. And I mean, I think that I read once, he said about 80% of all medical research is so shoddy we should not look at it. So again, don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. It's finding that 20% of value that we need to continue working on. And good science is saying, like, we repeat things over and over. We're not going to get it wrong 100% of the time. We need to pay attention when something works. Throw a lot away and carry on working with those things. And Ioannidis, I think, relative to this flu and viruses and the stuff going around now, the thing that stuff we knew and the data that was coming from studies in January and February is quite different from the studies coming out in June and July. The frequency of studies over this 6-month period is astronomically higher than in normal years. And this pandemic has really lit a fire under the rate of study, design, getting them done, publication. But I think that we need to keep adapting. We need to keep taking the newer data and combination or adding studies together and learning from that. And that I'm not sure has been done so well. The one thing that what Dr. Ioannidis said is that struck me as something very relevant is that the mortality rate with infection across almost all the age groups of COVID-19 seems to be extremely low right until you get to about 70 years old, but then it jumps radically to around 25%. So the mortality rate up to around 70 years old in most of the studies done seems to show that it is very little more dangerous than a seasonal flu. But if you happen to be 70 years old, then it's extremely dangerous. Perhaps that's where a lot of our resources, research, and high care needs to be focused in the at-risk groups. The people will say, oh yeah, but what about comorbidities and people with existing immune dysfunction and imbalance and what have you? Those are still very small numbers when you're looking at the numbers that are being thrown around in all the studies that we're seeing about the coronavirus and flu viruses. And a normal infection rate of seasonal flu is 10 million per year. It's a lot, you know, and if that's 0.0 something percent mortality, it's a large number of deaths. But that's just not my field. I'm just intrigued and interested, and it's.
How do you spell Ioannidis?
We talked about Ioannidis, Greek, Ioannidis. Okay. I'll send you the link, and if you want to put it up on your blog afterwards, it's a really worthwhile guy listening to.
Okay, great. I think that'll help. I'll paste it while we're doing questions. Yeah, a lot of people don't even know in America about 1 million people die every year from medicine alone.
Yeah. You know, the studies that Ioannidis was involved in doing was looking at, Joy asked a question about SSRIs. And there's pretty much consensus now that in the proper studies, like decent double-blind controlled RCTs and meta-analyses and systematic reviews, there is basically very little benefit you get over taking an SSRI for mild to moderate depression over the placebo. It hardly does anything. And it has a big list of side effects. So something like SSRIs, I'm absolutely not saying if you're on them, don't bother taking them. Or if somebody in your healthcare team is considering you going on them, I'm just saying investigate more. That's one of the worth it things to investigate getting off or using something else. Talk to Peter about some of his mood balancing superfoods. But Ioannidis' groups of researchers looked at SSRIs. I don't know, that's one of the areas. Statin drugs come up as well as being like, oh my golly, are these things going to be worth it? Again, we don't have to answer the question for all the people ever studied. We know there are certain genetic variants that make statins likely to work in you or likely not to work in you. I'd like to know that before I started eating them to control a cholesterol problem.
Fantastic. Sure. There was so much good stuff there. Thank you for your time. Maybe if we can just do a couple of questions. If you guys have any specific questions, we've got 5 minutes or so. And can't find John's website directly, but I can post his name in here at least. Or if you've got something specific that you've seen that you liked, pop it in here too.
Peter, Nanette asked earlier on about her problem with conventional medical practitioners is they don't ask questions. Questions that even myself, not being a doctor, would think to ask. I think that basically is saying, that they don't listen. You know, if you ask a question, then you have to sit back and listen to the answer. Absolutely, most general practitioners would do well with sort of postgraduate work in qualitative research and qualitative question asking, or what do you call it? Qualitative research means asking questions and talking to patients.
For sure. And like you said, it's 18 seconds, right? That's the number. So.
Come on, you can hang in longer than that.
I've posted your web address there for people who want to check out your stuff. House of Holistic Health, is that the best place to look at what you do and to get hold of you?
Yeah, absolutely. That's fine.
Great. Anyone else?
Medical aids from Ilana Rabinovitz. There are a lot of Momentum and FNB in South Africa. If you're a member somehow there, they will give you 1 or 2 of the genetics panels and then assign you to a practitioner, a clinician, to deal with the feedback, at which point we could sort of upsell or help you look at other panels which might be relevant to what your investigation. But that's starting.
Oh, fantastic.
Yeah, but and I also know that Dame Smith, I think she's still the chief medical officer in the United Kingdom. She's gone on record as saying, if the government could basically just say every United Kingdom citizen can get a genetic test and improve the precision of their medicine, it would mean, I'd go as far as to say it's in excess of billions of pounds savings because of not misdiagnosis, but misprescription and poor prescriptions of drugs that are not going to work, and just helping the doctors be more precise. So these are things that take a while to change, and it's probably a good thing. If we were barking up the wrong tree, it would be relevant also to slow things down. We need to ask questions. We need to do the studies. We need to get the data.
Fantastic. Amazing. I think we've covered all of it. Doesn't look like anyone. We did such a good job that no one has any questions.
It's always good.
Awesome. Well, guys, if you're happy, we're happy. That was amazing. So much great content. Thank you so much for your time. We will be putting the recording up on our website, and you're welcome to obviously the web page, which I'll paste here too, on our site, which has all my past conversations. You guys can check that out. It takes a few days, but this one will be up in the next few days. And what am I doing next week? Next week, I think I'm interviewing Tony. Tony Budden.
Oh, yeah, awesome.
So Tony and I will chat all things hemp and cannabis and interesting stuff on that line. So CBD is quite a buzzword at the moment. I'm sure we'll get into depths there. So any of you who are listening, you want to get into that, so join us next week.
Thanks, Peter. Thank you, everyone.
Great. I'll just unmute everybody, or at least allow people, maybe if I can do it. And then everyone
Tony will be keen. Tony will be excited to know that there's an endocannabinoid system of genetics in one of the South African genetics panels.
Oh, really?
Very interesting. I should send that to you ahead of your conversation.
Please, yeah, please send it. Okay, so now everyone's unmuted. You can all say goodbye and thank you very much, and we'll check you all again next week.
Bye.
Muchas gracias.
De nada.
Thank you very much.
Have a lovely evening, everybody. Great to see you all.
Stay safe, guys.
Yeah.
Wear masks.
Okay, bye.